Please go to elithecomputerguy.com in order to view schematics, code, and more for the projects that you are learning about. Welcome back. So in today's video, I want to do a brief overview of the difference between public, private, and hybrid clouds. So this is an important subject nowadays, but unfortunately, a lot of people get confused on something that should be relatively simple. Now, the important thing to remember whenever we're talking about cloud computing is the primary thing when we're talking about cloud computing is that you are simply not able to point to a specific physical machine and know for absolute certain that that physical machine is providing the services that you are using. So back in the old days, if you had an Active Directory server or if you had a web server, basically everything was married to that physical box. You had the physical machine, you had the operating system installed on the physical machine, you had the services configured for that physical machine, and so you could say that machine right there is the Active Directory server. So if you try to log into the network, that is the server that you're going to be going to. Or if you had a web server, you would have a web server, and that is the server that you are going to be going to. Now, in this modern world of cloud computing, the big concept here is simply, it's coming from that infrastructure over there, right? So if you have an Active Directory cluster, so Active Directory provides security services on a Microsoft network, basically you know that you are, whenever somebody logs in, that they are then logging into the cluster, but you may not know specifically which machine that they are connecting to. If you have a VMware cluster, a hypervisor cluster, basically you have instances of server operating systems running in that cluster, you may have 10 physical machines, and then the management software of that cluster will move the instances around within the cluster, within those 10 different physical machines as it sees fit based off of the rules that you have configured. Now, I do want to stop people here. A lot of times when we have new people, right? New people really like to do that whole stump the chump thing. They really like to poke holes in concepts and go, ha ha, the teacher isn't really as smart as they think they are. Obviously, you can know what physical machine an instance is running on, right? You can go into the management console, and if you go into the management console, you can see what the instance is, you can see what physical machine it's actually operating on, and you need this sometimes to do basically maintenance and that kind of tasks. So obviously, you can know what physical machine it's on. But that kind of misses the point. The point that we're going here with the whole cloud computing infrastructure is more the idea of at first blush, you don't necessarily know which specific piece of hardware that you're dealing with. And really, one of the more important things here is that the hardware is no longer as important as it used to be. Again, a big problem in the old days, 20 years ago, if you had an Active Directory server, a web server, or anything else, right? You could spend a lot of money, you could put a lot of time configuring that box, you could put it in the best server room in the world. But you know, if the CPU fan, if one stupid ass CPU fan fails, that $10,000 server that you spent the past week configuring goes offline and nobody can use it. So one of the big things too with the cloud computing concept is that each server itself or each node is no longer a single point of failure for the system. You can have entire physical machines completely die, disappear, just go away, get sucked up in a tornado, and your infrastructure should keep working. So this is a big thing to remember about with cloud computing. That's why it can get a little bit confusing, especially when we start talking about private clouds, because when people think about the cloud, right, they think about the cloud, the internet. And so when they say, well, wait a minute, but if you have a private cloud, so if you have all these servers in your own data center, how is that the cloud? The cloud is out there. Anything here is local, so it's obviously not the cloud. But with cloud computing, the important thing to be thinking about is it's not the cloud or whatever. It's more this idea of you if you just simply do not know. You can't at first blush be able to point and go, I know when you go to the website that is being hosted on only this machine, right? The idea with cloud computing You can be hitting any number of nodes. They are providing services for your users. And again, if any single node fails, it doesn't really matter. The other big thing to remember about with cloud computing is basically once we started moving into the whole cloud computing architecture, we started moving more and more into something called a services-oriented architecture. So you will see something called COA. So back in the old days, and still exists to a degree, you have what's called the client-server architecture. So you had client machines that would communicate with servers, right? So you would have an Active Directory server. So that server would do your Active Directory, and it would be your SMB, your file shares, might do FTP, might be VPN, may do a whole bunch of other things, right? But it was a client server. So you had the client computer, and it was getting everything from the server itself. Again, the server, the hardware, the services were all married. They're all super glued into one box. So you couldn't separate the two. And so that's where you would come into the idea of, again, domains in the Microsoft world. So you would have Active Directory servers or domain controllers. You would have your member computers, and they would be communicating with those particular servers. So that's a client server architecture. When we go into the services-oriented architecture, what we start thinking about is instead of thinking about servers, right? Again, one of the things we're trying to abstract in the cloud computing world, we're trying to abstract out the actual services and the things being provided. And so what we want to start thinking more about is services. Instead of thinking about the server itself, you start thinking about the service that that server provides. And then you think about the different ways those services can be provided to your end user. So that's when you start thinking about, let's say, a hybrid cloud computing model. Instead of thinking about a database server, you start thinking about the service of a database, right? Some place to basically be able to store data and then be able to run SQL queries against it. And so one of the things that you can do is you can actually simply rent database services from a company like AWS or Azure, because then you're not worried about the physical servers themselves. You're not even worried about the instances of servers. You just say, I need a database service, and I will connect to their database service, and that is where I will push and pull data from. So one of the big things, again, when we start thinking about cloud computing in the real world, is again this idea of services-oriented architecture, where we're not really worried about the servers themselves. We're not worried about the Exchange server. We're not worried about the web server. We're thinking about the services. I need email services for my users. I need web services for my users. I need whatever services for my users. How can I provide those to my users? Again, with something like Active Directory, that might be best coming from a physical Active Directory cluster. But then you do something like some database service, and you're like, well, do I really want my own MS SQL databases in my own server room? Or maybe that's something I can basically outsource, basically purchase that service from a company such as Azure or maybe AWS or something else. And so then my servers will connect to that service and be able to provide my end users the services that they require. So these are some of the things to be thinking about when you start thinking about the cloud computing world. And to also remember, again, this is a concept, a way of thinking about your infrastructure, a way of thinking about your architecture. Where again, back in the old days, it was all servers. You had client machines, you had servers, and you had some peripherals like network attached printers, things like that, right? So you were focused on just building out your servers, making sure they had replication strategies, doing all that kind of thing. In this modern world of cloud computing, you're thinking more of this services-oriented architecture. You're thinking about just the service itself. And so you start thinking, okay, do I need an Exchange server, or can I just get Office 365? Okay, so I'm just going to buy the Office 365 cloud service. So that's a cloud service to provide email services to your end user. On the other hand, Active Directory, right? I'm going to need local machines for Active Directory. So I'll create my own local Active Directory cluster. And so that will provide the security services on my network. And then you start sitting there and you're like, okay, well, this is what I need a physical box for, and okay, this is what I need, a cloud service for, and this is something that probably would be run better in the cloud, but I actually want to be able to hyper configure everything for the server, so I'll create an instance of a server up in the cloud in order to provide those services. And so that's kind of the way that you start thinking about building your infrastructure in this new cloud computing world. And the important thing to be thinking about, again, with the idea of cloud computing, is more, you can't specifically point to a server, to a physical box that's providing the service. You create this infrastructure, you create this architecture that simply provides the services that your users need through multiple different ways. So with that, let's go over to the whiteboard so I can start explaining this a little bit better. Again, we're going to go over the public clouds, we're going to go over private clouds, and then we're going to go over what's really cool, the hybrid cloud architecture, where again, in current day, if you're not using just a little bit of hybrid cloud infrastructure architecture at this point in time, you really got to question what you're doing to your users and your company. So anyways, with that, let's go over to the whiteboard and I'll explain this stuff a little bit better. So let's first start talking about the public cloud. So this is what most people will be like, yeah, I understand what you're talking about. But for a lot of new people, you probably actually don't. So when we start talking about the public cloud, basically we're talking about the cloud computing that is outside of your premises. So normally when you think about the public cloud, you're thinking about AWS, you're thinking about Azure, you're thinking about something like Digital Ocean, Cloudflare, any number of providers. So the idea here is you literally own no physical hardware. None of their equipment is sitting in your data center. You are simply purchasing services from them. If you're using something like Digital Ocean, maybe you're simply spinning up instances of operating systems up in the cloud. If you're using Azure or AWS, maybe you're doing more sophisticated things. Again, tapping into something like an MS SQL database service in Azure Cloud, or any number of things that AWS provides. So the first thing that you need to be thinking about when you're going to be dealing with the public cloud is the stack that you're going to be using. And so, and this is incredibly important, and this is one of those things that screws people up when they initially build out their cloud infrastructure. If they're not thinking about the stack, not just now, but going into the future, you can run into a lot of problems later. So what am I talking about with the stack? The stack is all the technology, all the products that are going to be required in order for your infrastructure to work. So if you're thinking about like a full stack developer, you hear about full stack developers, and full stack developers will need to be able to understand Linux. They'll need to be able to understand like a PHP or a Ruby or a Python back-end language. They'll need to understand JavaScript, front-end languages. They'll need to understand databases, and they'll need to understand a number of different other technologies. And so this is what your stack is, right? So in order to fully deploy products to your end users or customers, you need Linux, you need the back-end programming language, you need the front-end programming language, you need the database, and you need whatever else is required. And so that's the full stack. That's something to be thinking about, right? So when you're thinking about the stack and you're thinking about something like DigitalOcean. So DigitalOcean, more or less, they just provide instances of operating systems for you, right? So you can spin up an instance of Ubuntu, or I think you can do Windows, right? Basically, you're just spinning up instances. You pay them $5 or $10 a month for that. So when you're thinking about the stack, you may not have a lot to worry about with the stack, right? You know, you think about your stack and you're like, well, we need Linux. Like, let's say we're going to just spin up a basic web server. So your company is going to do, oh, I don't know, you're just going to do a WordPress site, really? So your company is going to need a WordPress site up in the cloud. You want to be able to deal with some configurations or whatever. So what is the real stack that's required there? You need Linux, you need Apache, or I suppose the cool people nowadays do Engine X. So basically you need some kind of a web server. Again, you need PHP on there. And then a few other technologies, something like WordPress or whatever else, right? So if you're thinking, okay, my stack is just a single Linux box, some web server, some PHP, WordPress, then doing something like DigitalOcean may make a lot of sense. Like that's all you need for your stack. And you start thinking about it like with your company, and you're like, well, what cloud services are we really gonna need? And you sit there and you're like, well, okay, so we're gonna use DigitalOcean for one instance of a server. We're not going to get that many people in a day. Like we're going to get less than 1,000 users coming to our site in a day. So one instance on DigitalOcean, that's fine. For our email services, we're going to use Office 365 or Gmail or something like that. So okay, so DigitalOcean is fine. Right now, DigitalOcean is fine. And frankly, 5 or 10 years from now, probably DigitalOcean is fine. But it's important to understand that if you're going to be creating a larger scale infrastructure, a more complicated infrastructure, infrastructure, there's more to the stack than simply this basic thing that we're talking about here with DigitalOcean, right? So that's one of the reasons why a lot of people go with Azure. So Azure is Microsoft's cloud, and one of the big things with Azure being Microsoft cloud is that it uses the full Microsoft stack, right? So if you're thinking about the Microsoft stack, what that means is things like Active Directory. Again, a lot of the kids, for some reason, like to laugh at Active Directory. Let me tell you, being a real IT professional, I love Active Directory. I will throw money at CALs, right? So there's something called CALs, Client Access Licenses. So whenever you spin up a Microsoft server, not only do you have to pay for the server itself, but you have to pay for every CAL, basically every connection to that Active Directory server. It used to be $50. It's probably somewhere around that price now. And again, for a lot of new people, a lot of 18-year-olds, they hear that you have to spend $50 in order to connect, each host to an Active Directory server, and they lose their mind. Let me tell you, as somebody who's actually dealt with tech in the real world, I love Active Directory. Active Directory is great. Active Directory gives you all of your security policies. It gives you all of your user management, your group management, organizational units, all kinds of different things you can do with Active Directory. So basically, Active Directory is one of those great services that works so well, most people don't even realize it's there. It's like it's so good and it's so smooth and it does what the hell it's supposed to do so well that people don't want to pay for it, because they just assume all computer systems do what Active Directory does. And then you're like, no, Microsoft Active Directory is a beautiful thing. So anyways, so that's something to be thinking about, right? So if you've got a organization that's been around for 10 or 20 years, the reality is they will have built their infrastructure up until this point, most likely using Microsoft. And so up until what that means is they've been using the Microsoft stack. So again, you think about something like Active Directory. You think about Exchange Server. So Exchange Server is the email and calendar and all of that kind of stuff server. Microsoft now has Teams. So Teams is it's supposed to be their version of Slack. But basically, there's a lot of different products. And one of the great parts about the stack, too, is that all of these different things can communicate with each other. When you log in with Active Directory, that then gives you access to your email services. So you log in and it knows, you're Eli at, let's say, elithecomputerguy.com. So these emails are for you. The calendar is for you. If you start trying to use Teams, it knows who you are, it knows who your friends or have connections with too, and is able to tie all of that stuff in together. And so you add on top of that things like file servers, web servers, all kinds of different products and offerings, and basically that's what you start dealing with the stack. And so this is an important thing to be thinking about with using the public cloud, is you go, well, I can just spin up something on DigitalOcean and it'll be relatively inexpensive, no big deal. Yeah, but does DigitalOcean offer Active Directory? Does DigitalOcean offer Microsoft SQL services? Like, again, if you've got Microsoft SQL servers running, simply going with a cloud provider that can actually host that for you might be a valuable thing. Again, file servers and web servers and Teams and Exchange email and all of these different things. And the important thing is that they can all tie rather seamlessly together and be able to communicate well together. So that's where you're looking at with something like the Microsoft stack. On the other hand, if you look at AWS and you look at their stack, they've got a lot of functionality. So beyond the thing of simply spinning up instances, right? So you can spin up an instance of something like Ubuntu or Microsoft or whatever else. They also provide a lot of different things like virtual networking, which can be really amazing, right? So again, the networking is the communication between all of your servers and all of your systems up in the cloud. And one of the cool things you can do with AWS stack is you can actually choose how communication gets routed, whether it's just between particular servers or between like regions. So if you have different regions, how traffic actually gets routed. So that can be a very important thing. So nowadays there are becoming a lot more laws that countries are putting on the book stating that the data for users of that country has to stay within the country itself. So if you're able to control your networking in the AWS stack, basically what you can have is any user in one particular country, all of their data will get stored and in a server that's actually in their region or in their country, right? So you log in and you're in Europe, and basically it will store all the data in Europe to maintain compliance. Where if I'm over here in the United States, I may get routed to an entirely different server because our laws are different. So that's something that you can have in the AWS stack. Again, they have their own implementations of things like databases. They have an implementation of the MySQL database. So if you're using MySQL, again, let's say you have a WordPress site or something like that that's actually become very popular. You have lots of people hammering your site, so you no longer want to have to host your own MySQL server. They actually have a MySQL implementation, and so you can simply drop your data. Basically, you can export your database into their implementation of MySQL, and then you can point your servers at that, and that now becomes your database engine for the website that you have. And so this is what you're going to be thinking about when you're thinking about the public cloud computing providers. And one of the big things to be thinking about is what is the stack that you need. If you don't need very much, basically you just need to spin up, I don't know, some server to do backups to, an FTP server, some kind of web server, something like that. Going with DigitalOcean makes a lot of sense. Yeah, hey, why waste money on AWS or Azure? On the other hand, again, if you've got a larger scale infrastructure, like if you're dealing with an old legacy company. So you've got a legacy company, you've got 10,000 users, things have been built out over the past couple of decades. I have to tell you, you're most likely going to want the Azure stack, the Microsoft stack, because this is going to have Active Directory, this is going to have MS SQL, this is going to be drop-in replacements for so many of the things that you're already using. On the other hand, maybe you're a new, hot, sexy, young startup company, and who the hell uses it? Like Outlook? Outlook? Oh, it's so funny. Oh, millennials. Whenever I talk to millennials about Outlook, they make me feel old. I remember when Outlook was the killer app. I used to love Outlook, right? But again, maybe this is a new startup company. You're spinning everything up. You're less than a year old. Everything, you're not worried. Active Directory is old and stupid. Outlook sure as hell is old and stupid, right? But you want to spin up something. Again, let's say you're going to be spinning up the next Snapchat. You're going to be spinning up the next Instagram or something like that. So you need file servers, you need compression servers, you need some kind of authentication servers, you need routing. Again, you need that full stack, but you don't need the Microsoft stack. So again, going over with something like to AWS, their stack may provide you a lot better options. And the good part about working within the stack is then you don't have to have like lots of different user accounts, because one thing you would think about, like you're like, well, Eli, I could use DigitalOcean, and I could use Cloudflare, and I could use another company and another company, another company, another company. So what? I don't like AWS. I'm just going to use, 10 different companies to provide the services that I need. But you have to remember, that's 10 different user accounts. That's 10 different credit card things going in there. That's 10 different startups that, could crash and burn tomorrow. That's adding a whole bunch of complexity when, again, you could go with just AWS or Azure. You have one user account, or you have their one account management system. They have your credit card and their payment information. All of their stuff, basically, it's very easy to connect all of these services together. It's like little Lego bricks. You can just connect everything together and build things very quickly. Not only that, but again, with Azure and something like AWS, these are companies with a metric crap ton of money behind them that nobody wants to see fail. And so they will most likely be around for a long time. Or again, nothing against DigitalOcean itself, but if you go with some other startup provider, right, there are a lot of other public cloud providers out there, and the reality is, right, they could disappear tomorrow. They literally, you're like, this is the greatest thing about it. Their price point is awesome, their service is awesome, everything is great, and then they disappear. And again, like if you're thinking about an organization, like you're really worrying about whether the startup company is going to still be in business, a week from now is an important thing to be thinking about. So these are some of the things to be thinking about when you're thinking about a public cloud infrastructure and why some of this stuff is really important. So now that we've talked about the public cloud infrastructure, let's talk about the private cloud infrastructure. Now, I know at this point you're probably like, I know private cloud infrastructure. I'm just going to skip over to where it starts talking about hybrid. But again, this is one of those big problems that we have is so many people don't really think about things like the private cloud infrastructure enough when they're building out infrastructure or they're doing migrations, and they run into problems in the future. So we're talking about private cloud. So basically, when we're talking about private cloud, again, we're not talking about the cloud out there. We're not talking about the cloud that we connect to. That is the public cloud. We are talking about the cloud that you're essentially going to be creating within your own premises. So with this may be something like a VMware or a Citrix hypervisor cluster. So you have instances of operating systems that move through all of the physical machines in that particular cluster. This may be something like an Active Directory cluster from Microsoft. So again, Active Directory is security services. So when people need to log in to get access to network resources, you may have a cluster like that, or again, something such as a SAN, so a storage area network. This would store all the data for things like servers, might be backup data, might be file shares, maybe the instances of the operating systems that are running in the VMware cluster. But the important thing to be thinking about when we're talking about the private cloud is we're looking at the overall cluster. We're looking at the services provided by the cluster. We're not hyper-focused on the physical machine, right? So back in the day, you would have a Active Directory server, and that's what you were focused on. Now you have an Active Directory cluster, and as long as nothing too stupid happens, even if a physical machine completely and utterly fails, you will still be getting Active Directory services from that cluster. So again, that's what we're talking about with the cloud. So even though it's internal in your premises, you're not really pointing at a specific machine about the services it's providing. You're looking at the cluster of machines that are providing these services. Now, an important thing to be thinking about when you're dealing with the private cloud is basically what vendors you're going to go with. So again, you've got a VM. Oh, I'm horrible at writing. You got VMware, you have Citrix, you have Microsoft and products like Hyper-V and Active Directory. You have the different SANs that are out there. You have different database services and the whole 9 yards. And so when you're going to be building out your private cloud infrastructure, you need to be thinking about the vendors and you need to be thinking about how well they play with each other, right? So again, with VMware, you can launch instances of Microsoft operating systems or Linux operating systems or Solaris, I suppose, if you want to, right? You can do the same thing with Citrix. You can do the same thing with Microsoft Hyper-V. So one of the things you need to be thinking about is what else are you concerned about beyond the instance itself, right? So that's the thing, is having an instance of a server at this point is not necessarily the most significant issue. There's a lot of different products out there that can provide that can deal with instances of servers. So things you need to be thinking about is such as licensing schemes, right? So with Microsoft has some interesting things with their licensing schemes when you start spinning up virtual machines. So depending on what license of Microsoft server you purchase, it will also come with additional licenses for virtual machines. So I think if you buy the basic server version, Microsoft server, let's say 2019, I think it comes with 2 licenses in Hyper-V for spinning up additional servers. So that's something to think about. You're like, okay, well, maybe money's a little bit tight. So if I buy 1 license of server 2019, that will give me 2 virtual machines that I can run in Hyper-V where I don't have to pay any additional licensing fee. Where if I buy VMware, I purchase VMware, and then I've got to purchase all the licenses on top of that. And so the money for VMware in your particular infrastructure might be a lot more. But something to think about is VMware has a lot of very good products for things such as high availability. So when you're creating VMware clusters, so that whole high availability deal where you can put in a lot of rules and you can say if one physical machine fails, what happens with the instances. You can put rules in for basically how much load you want on each physical machine. So if the load on a physical machine goes above 80% for so let's say the CPU load, then I want to auto migrate an instance of one of the servers that's running on that particular physical machine to a different physical machine, right? a lot of that's one of the things that you need to be thinking about. Again, Citrix has their own things. Again, if you're dealing with SANs, storage area networks, different SANs work with different products better. Again, so if you're dealing with VMware, so you may want to purchase a particular SAN product. On the other hand, with Microsoft, again, Microsoft has a lot of stuff built into it. And so one of the things you can be thinking about is like, well, why do I want to buy an entirely new SAN product when Microsoft has the storage spaces. So they have their own storage, kind of SAN-ish. Let's say it's SAN-ish. They have a SAN-ish product. So again, if you're trying to save money, you've already decided you're going to be dealing with Hyper-V because you like the fact that it will save you money as far as not having to purchase so many licenses, then you might say, okay, instead of going with another NetApp or some other SAN provider, I'm just going to spin up a couple of more Windows servers that will provide storage using this storage spaces technology. And so these are some of the things that you need to be thinking about when you're thinking about creating your private cloud, is not simply what product does the instance or what product does the storage, but also how it all works together. Who partners with whom, right? So if you're going to spin up a VMware cluster of hypervisors, one of the things to look at is what SAN companies, what storage companies actually partner with VMware to make sure that their products will work best with VMware. Again, that's something to think about, right? So you're going to create a cluster of hypervisors, and then you need a SAN, you need some kind of place to store all the instances. And so going out and looking and finding the partners of VMware that have verified that their storage solutions actually work appropriately with VMware. That's something to be thinking about. Again, the thing with like licensing, what is the overall cost going to be? Okay, you buy VMware, and then you have to buy all the licenses, and then you have to do all of those things. And basically, when you look at that math, you may find one product is significantly more expensive for your specific situation. Again, that's an important thing to be thinking about when you're dealing with organizations and businesses. Different organizations, different businesses have different situations. So when you're building out an infrastructure, right, the infrastructure for one company may look a lot different than the infrastructure for a different company, again, based off of things like whatever their current agreements are, cost structure, different types of things. So these are some of the things that you need to be thinking about when you're talking about building out a private cloud. And then beyond that too, as we talked about up here, with the public providers, is also being careful about the small companies, right? So you have the startup companies out there. So there's a lot of startup companies. They're building their own private cloud solutions. Well, one of the problems you may run into is what happens if that startup company fails. There was one company I liked back in the day. I think, it wasn't called Iron Mountain. Anyways, there was one company. If you go back about 10 years ago, there was this really cool virtualization company. So back when the whole hypervisor craze was new and it was cool and it was exciting, it wasn't old technology, there was this one company out there that created this really awesome hypervisor cluster software. They had an awesome price point. Like the price point was awesome. The configurability was awesome. The reliability was awesome. Everybody loved their product. I forget exactly what it was named, but it was just this amazing piece of virtualization software, right? You could expand clusters. It was awesome. Like it was what I call a credit card scaling, where literally you swipe your credit card, you buy a new node, you slap the node in, and it was working. It was just the greatest. It really was. It was great. The Air Force was using it. Major corporations were using it. It was just absolutely awesome, especially back when VMware seemed a little bit more quirky. I'm not sure Hyper-V was around, or if Hyper-V was around, it was in like version 1, right? So if you looked at all the competition out there, whatever this company was, it was just absolutely awesome. It was A++++++. And so I was thinking about using this for some of my clients. Well then, Oracle swooped in. So Oracle swooped in, bought this amazing startup company, and then literally stopped selling any licenses to it. That's not a joke. That's not an exaggeration. That is literally what happened. This really awesome virtualization company was purchased by Oracle, And literally the first thing that Oracle did was stop selling licenses to it. So imagine this. Imagine you're building out an infrastructure, right? So you already have 100 nodes in your cluster, and basically, you're scaling out. So it's, I've got 100 nodes. I know within the next 5 years, we're going to get to 1,000 nodes. So this company is great. The price point is great. My techs is very easy for my technicians to be able to use. So we have found the product that we're going to use, and we are just going to keep buying this product. Like every month, we're going to buy another 10 of these boxes. And then Oracle comes in and buys the company and stops selling any, like not even a joke. They literally just stopped selling licenses. They said they stopped selling licenses. They stopped selling the upgrades, so there weren't going to be any new versions coming out. And then they were going to like support it with security updates for like a year or two, like whatever their contract like required them to do. And that was it. And so again, like I think it was the Air Force. The Air Force had invested quite a bit of money into that particular virtualization company because it was such a great product, and they got screwed pretty hard on that. And so again, that's something you have to think about. So going with the VMwares of the world, going with the Microsofts or the Citrixes or the big names, that really is far more important than a lot of people give credit to. So now that you have the idea of public cloud computing and private cloud computing, let's start talking about hybrid. So basically, all hybrid is you have your premises, you have your infrastructure, and you have a cloud environment there. Again, you have VMware running, you have Active Directory clusters, you have whatever else. And then what you're going to be doing in a hybrid infrastructure is then you are going to be connecting that to the services provided by Azure, or AWS, or even things such as what are called disaster recovery as a service. That is pretty cool. And so basically the idea here is that this becomes all one infrastructure. As far as you logically think about it, right? Well, in the technology world, you look at things from the physical standpoint and then from the logical standpoint, right? So from the physical standpoint, this is one infrastructure and this is another infrastructure, right? This is the infrastructure that's sitting in your data center, and this is the infrastructure sitting up in somebody else's data center. So physically they are separate. But when you start creating VPNs, you start creating your routing for network traffic, you start connecting the different services together. What happens is that they logically become one infrastructure. And so again, that's one of the important things to be thinking about in this whole cloud world, is realizing the difference between the physical infrastructure and the logical infrastructure. As far as how you're thinking about the services being provided to the end user, you need to be thinking about this as one single logical infrastructure. So what do I mean by that? So again, let's say we're talking about Azure, right? So we're talking about Azure, and you have your nice little Microsoft Cloud in premises, and you're using Microsoft Cloud up in the Azure cloud, right? So let's talk about that whole Active Directory thing again. So again, Active Directory is the security services. Well, one of the cool things, one of the really awesome things, is you can actually have Active Directory servers up in the Azure cloud. So why might that be valuable to you? So let's say, let's say you have a user, right? And so you have a user, and that user has a laptop computer, because everybody has laptop computers nowadays. So, right, that user, as far as that user is concerned, all they want is to be able to log into their computer and get access to whatever services that they need, right? So let's say they're at your property, they're at your premises, they go to log in, and when they go to log in, they get automatically routed to the closest Active Directory server. So they get routed there, they get their security credentials, and then they're able to log in and use whatever resources are on the network. Well, what happens if they decide to go to a remote office, or if they're staying in a hotel or something like that? So let's say they use VPN services. They use a VPN to go up to the cloud. And then one of the questions you have to ask yourself is, do I trust this person? Like if I can see the person, I trust them. But do I trust somebody logging in to our internal network from out on the road in a hotel, something like that? Because that's one of the big problems in the security world is using VPN services, right? Somebody from a remote site is able to gain access into your internal network. If something has compromised their system or something like that, they can cause a lot of issues on your internal network. So wouldn't it be nice if they use a VPN service and instead of connecting to the internal Active Directory servers you have running in your server room, they simply connect to the Active Directory server sitting up in the Microsoft Azure cloud, right? So they use VPN, they use routing and remote access, something like that. They hit the Azure cloud. The Azure cloud, instead of routing to your premises, they just authenticate you up on the cloud, and then you get your credentials and you're able to use whatever services that you need. Again, you may say, well, let's put like some file servers, right? So again, let's say we have salespeople that are on the road. And so we go, do we really want salespeople on the road, from the road, being able to get into our own internal infrastructure? That just seems like a bad idea. So again, we'll put an Active Directory server up here. We'll put the file server up here. But the important thing, again, when we start talking about logically, is that logically, these two Active Directory servers are synchronizing with each other. Again, we talk about replication strategies. So when user accounts change, anything like that, that information is being synchronized. They essentially see themselves on one network. Again, this file server here, you may have the file server here that actually then, using network connections or whatever else, backs up to some kind of backup solution that you actually have on premises. So even though this file server is up on the cloud, again, as far as your backup system is concerned, it's just on the network. Again, if it's IP addressable, right? The system doesn't care. And so this is where you start thinking about building that infrastructure. So although you have two theoretically different infrastructures from that logical point of view, as far as your security and your backup systems are concerned, as far as your users are concerned, this is just one overall one logical infrastructure. So when you start thinking about hybrid, and what I would argue, like everybody needs to be using hybrid right now. If you're not using a hybrid cloud infrastructure, I don't know what you're doing, is to think about things like disaster recovery as a service. And again, this is where you start thinking about, don't think about Azure or AWS. Think about these services. Wouldn't it be nice? Wouldn't it be nice? And so disaster recovery as a service is amazing. So a company called Veeam, Veeam, makes backup software, so basically backup software for virtual machines. So what's really cool about Veeam is, let's say you have your little hypervisor cluster, right? And you've got all of your instances of servers running on this hypervisor cluster. And so you use the Veeam backup software, and the Veeam backup software goes and it backs up all these different instances. Well, as I've talked about before, one of the great things about instances, basically virtual machines, is that they're one intact file, right? You can move one intact file from one place to another and then spin it up, basically turn it on in the new place. So one of the cool things with disaster recovery as a service is you can use Veeam, and then what Veeam can do is it can back up to a service provider. So you actually have online backup service providers. And one of the cool parts is, and they have their own clusters. So during normal circumstances, right, Veeam will back up to the service provider, and then maybe somebody lost a file or something stupid happened, and you can get that one file and you can bring it back. But here's the thing. What happens if there's a tornado? What happens if there's a flood? What happens if something really stupid happens and your entire freaking cluster is gone? Right? Your hypervisor cluster is just dead, gone, ain't gonna get spun up, right? This is just an absolute misery. It's gonna take you a month to be able to get everything spun back up again. Well, what's cool with disaster recovery as a service is you've been backing up whole instances of virtual machines. And your service provider has clusters of these hypervisors. And so what they can do is not only do they keep your data for you, but they can actually start spinning up your instances within their cloud. So if you have Active Directory, if you have an email server, if you have a web server, anything like that, basically what you need to do is you need to go into your networking equipment, and you need to change your routing possibly to point at the service provider versus pointing at your infrastructure. But then all of these instances can now be spun up within their infrastructure. So your users are now able to log in. Your users are able to get the files. Your users are able to do basic work as you're trying to figure out how the hell to rebuild your infrastructure that was literally taken out by a flood or a tornado or something else like this. Now, obviously, the service provider is going to charge you a good chunk of money in order to do this, but this is one of the things you have to think about in the business world. I would rather have to spend a lot of money to get a service that's required in order to keep my business running than not have to spend money because basically that option isn't even provided. So disaster recovery as a service is one of these. Again, like at this point, if you don't care about Azure, you don't care about AWS, and you just think I've been doing a lot of talking, this is the point you need to realize. Like, if you have not looked at disaster recovery as a service, you just need to look at that. But then beyond that, again, like we talk about, like again, the Azure cloud. So if you're using Microsoft Azure, you can do a lot of really cool things with Microsoft Azure. Again, like you've got your premises, and let's say you have a database server. So you have a database server, and that database server normally does a limited amount of processing. So for whatever reason, let's say you have new customers. So you have new customers, they start using your business. They start becoming clients of your business, and so their information gets put into a database. But then imagine for a second, let's say your business buys another business. And that other business has a whole metric crap ton of users already, right? So let's say they've got 1 million users. A million. And so what needs to happen is they have their own database system. And so those 1 million users, basically they have to get migrated to your database system, and their data has to be integrated into your database system, making sure the first names are in the right place and the last names are in the right place, and basically making sure you don't lose information you need or any of that type of thing, right? Well, if you just got your own little putsy database server, again, you think about your little database server, it's got a Xeon processor, it's got 32 gigs of RAM, it's fine, it's doing its thing. But if you try to hammer it with 1 million records and then also using some kind of scripts in order to try to clean up those 1 million records, your database server is going to have a very bad day. So one of the things you can do is if you're using the Azure cloud, which is really cool. So let's say, again, with this database server, you'll be using Microsoft SQL, is they actually have Microsoft SQL services. Right? So literally what you could do before this big old migration is you could migrate the data you have in your current database server up to the Microsoft SQL database service that Microsoft offers. Then once that's happened, then you can provision this with however many resources you want. You then import into that Microsoft SQL service up on Azure. And basically you have all of this processing going on up on the Azure cloud, right? So you're gonna need a lot of CPU to do it. You're gonna need a lot of RAM to do it. You're gonna need a lot of IOPS, for storage, basically input outputs. And so basically while this process is happening, you can hammer the hell out of Microsoft's Azure system until it finishes. And then once it finishes, you can then export the results back down to your tiny little database server. And at this point, you're just adding a couple of people a day, deleting a couple of people a day. And so your database server from a day in, day out standpoint can handle the data, can handle the usage, but it's just this massive migration of information into it would kind of kill it. And so that's the kind of thing you can start dealing with the hybrid cloud infrastructure. And again, is pretty cool. Beyond that, again, in the Azure world, one of the nice things is something to think about, like if you're going to be doing a move. So I was responsible, or I helped out with a campus move back in the day, which really kind of sucked because everything was on physical servers. So when you got to move a lot of physical servers from one physical location to another physical location, and those servers make a business with thousands of employees run. Oh, it is nerve-wracking. Like we literally had to have multiple trucks. So we didn't simply have one moving truck. We literally had to have multiple moving trucks to move all the servers separately. So we figured out what servers were redundant, and then the redundant servers went on one truck, and then the other servers went on the other truck. And it was really a nail-biting thing. Again, it may seem like a joke, but the idea of moving your entire server room 20 miles away and realizing one person blasts through a red light and crashes into the truck with all your servers, and literally a business with thousands of employees can just be done, can just be toast, right? So one of the cool things you can do, let's say with Azure, is you can actually, again, you can move your instances of operating systems up to the cloud and then move them back again. So let's say we're in the Azure world. So let's say we're doing this move in the Azure world. One of the things that we could do is we could actually move the instances of our servers up to Azure. So basically, they're sitting on our clusters. We move them up to the Azure, and they're still all active. They're still all providing services. We then move simply the physical machines at this point, right? All the instances are up on the cloud. All the instances are providing all the services that they need. The users don't even realize that anything's going on. We then take all the physical machines in the trucks over to our new server room. We then, stand everything up there. We can drink a nice cup, we can leisurely drink a little bit of coffee. We can laugh. We can only work 12 hours instead of 18 hours because it doesn't matter. All the services are still being provided by Azure. And so we get the physical machines up and running. We spin up, one rack of machines. We make sure those are doing what they're supposed to do. And then we pull down however many instances should be running on those machines. Then we spin up the next rack of machines, and we pull down the instances for those machines. And we spin up the next rack of machines, and then we pull down the instances for those. And so that way, we can have a nice, leisurely way of being able to do a big tech migration like that without worrying all hell's gonna break loose. And again, it seems like a joke. But moving physical servers, again, you sneeze at a server. You sneeze at a server, and that thing can die. And so literally, you've got to unplug everything, right? You got to move these things through a building. You then have to put them on a vehicle, and that vehicle, even if the driver's trying to be nice, there's still vibration, there's still shocks, there's still potholes. You then got to pull it out of the truck, you then got to move it into the new building, then you got to plug everything in. And again, if you can kill a server simply by sneezing at it, imagine moving it 30 miles. And again, not just one. Imagine like what we had to do. We had to move hundreds of servers 30 miles and cross our fingers that everything spun back up. Wouldn't it be so much nicer if we could have just basically tossed the instances of the machines up into Azure? So Azure will be chugging along, doing what it's doing, and then we can just bring down those instances as need be. And so these are some of the things to be thinking about when we start thinking about hybrid cloud computing. And again, this is one of those where it's a concept. So you don't think about a specific product. You think about a problem that you're having, concerns that you have, and then you go out there and you just start doing a lot of research, and you see, what products actually offer the services that you want. So again, like with VMware, VMware is pretty cool with that, with their hypervisor solution, where basically they have their own cloud. And again, they have a very simple way of being able to seamlessly be able to toss instances up into their cloud and be able to pull them back again, basically with a couple of clicks and no big issues. So again, if you're doing a move, if you're doing a migration, if you need services, again, if you're gonna have a website that's gonna get hammered to high hell and back for like 1 week. So let's say you have a website, so you have a web server, it's doing its normal thing, and then next week you're gonna do a competition, right? So you're gonna do a competition and millions of people are gonna be hammering your website. So again, you throw the instance of your website up onto VMware's cloud. Everybody comes in, hammers the ever-loving hell out of it, and you don't care because VMware's cloud. You just pull out your credit card and you spend the money for it. It will cost you money. To be clear, it will cost money. But then, once that's over, that week's over, people aren't hammering your web server anymore. You just pull it back into your hypervisor cluster, and it's no big deal. And that's some of the really cool stuff that you can start dealing with when you really start thinking about cloud computing as an overall infrastructure, as an overall architecture, versus trying to just see it as a single product or technology. So that's the not so brief overview of public, private, and hybrid cloud computing. Again, it is important to realize that this is a way of thinking about building infrastructure that is different than how we used to build infrastructure. And so when you're going about trying to figure out what services your clients need or what things your businesses need, think more about the service-oriented architecture model versus the old client-server model. So the old client-server model is you've got an FTP server, you've got an Exchange server, you got a routing remote access server, right? That physical box is the VPN, and that physical box is the file server, and that physical box is the Active Directory server. Now we think about services. So again, we need authentication services, we need email services, we need VPN services. Maybe that would be provided best by a physical machine in our data center. Maybe that would be provided best by a service, again, from Office 365 or Gmail or something like that. Maybe it will be best to create an instance of a server and then throw that up onto Azure or AWS, right? You need to be thinking about, looking at your infrastructure and what services are required, and then figuring out what products then will provide those services in the best possible way. Again, we start talking about public cloud computing. Again, it's very important that you think about the stack. The stack. The stack is all the technology that's going to be required for your infrastructure. Now, that's where I talk about, like with AWS, if you have an old legacy infrastructure and you're using Active Directory, you're probably not going to want to go with AWS. Now, to be clear, no, don't, right? Don't get too much on my case. I'm not saying that no old legacy company that uses Active Directory would ever go to AWS, but you really got to look at the situation, right? If you're already using Active Directory, if you've already got MS SQL servers, if you already, again, are using Exchange, then why not go with the stack? Why not go with the cloud provider that 100% supports those services relatively seamlessly? Versus you could go to AWS, but then again, like instead of using Office 365, maybe then you'd have to be like spinning up instances of Exchange server in AWS and kind of duct taping things together. That probably is not a good idea. Or again, if you're a startup company, you don't care about Active Directory, you don't care about Outlook or whatever else, you may be looking at, again, to create the next Instagram or the next Snapchat, and you're sitting there and you're going, well, I need authentication services, I need storage services, I need compression services or whatever else, and AWS provides all those services, and it's relatively easy to code for and connect all of these things together, right? So in that situation, you may go with AWS. On the other hand, again, DigitalOcean is great. If you need a small stack, basically if you're just spinning up a web server, maybe a couple of web servers, that's it. Why pay the extra money for Azure or AWS when you can just spin up DigitalOcean? On the other hand, right, if you know your company is going to be growing and you're going to be using more and more cloud services in the next 5 years, you also don't want to start on DigitalOcean and then have to migrate to another cloud provider. Again, in the real world of tech, migrations suck. If there's one thing I think we can all agree on, migrations suck, right? So the fewer migrations you have to do in your entire career, the better. So again, if you know over the next 5 years your company is going to be growing significantly, I would highly suggest you don't go with DigitalOcean because, again, you're going to be needing all these other services. You're going to need all these other components from a stack. And so why not build off of that from the get-go and not have to worry about it as you grow? Again, as far as the private cloud is concerned, there's lots of different products out there that more or less seem to offer the same solutions, the same features, but it is important to understand that the small differences can be very, very significant. Again, like if you're using Microsoft and Hyper-V, the fact that Azure offers the Active Directory services up on the cloud, that can make your life very easy for being able to move things around and basically be able to have people log in, especially if they're remote workers. Again, with VMware makes it very easy to be able to move instances from your local physical machines up to the VMware cloud and then back down again. So these are some of the things to think about. Other things like licensing. Again, so many new IT professionals, I have no idea why, but they think terms of service and licensing is a joke. Like, that's not real professionals. Don't worry about the cost of cows. And again, like, that's something to be thinking about, right? If you go with a Microsoft server and you're doing Hyper-V, Again, don't quote me on how many virtual machines you get per server license, but it really is true. Where if you buy one server license, you'll get 2 virtual machine licenses, or maybe more than that, for simply spinning up in Hyper-V. So you sit there, and again, depending on how complicated your infrastructure is, you go, well, let's say I need 4 virtual machines. I know if I buy this one license for Microsoft Server, that also provides me the licenses I need for my other virtual servers that I'm going to be spinning up. So therefore, I could save a lot of money going with that solution versus going with VMware, where with VMware, I have to pay for VMware, and then on top of that, I have to pay for each server instance that I will be using on VMware. And so that's one of the things to be thinking about. And then finally, with hybrid cloud computing, again, and that's where we're really at in this modern world, is the idea with hybrid cloud computing is you have your local cloud infrastructure, and then there's also the cloud infrastructure that's out there. And the idea of being able to make all of that one logical unit, basically as far as your users are concerned. When they log into Active Directory, they don't even notice if they're logging into a local Active Directory server, or if they're logging into an Active Directory server that's sitting up on the Azure cloud. Again, the disaster recovery as a service. If you are running infrastructure right now, like of any value, and you're not using disaster recovery as a service, why not? Why not? Again, like I say, the old way of doing backups, right? You would do a backup. You back up all the data, and the physical server dies, then you'd have to restore the server. The nice thing with a local cloud is, again, you can have multiple Active Directory servers or multiple hypervisor servers that are running. But one of the things you really need to think about, and again, in the modern world, apocalypse. Again, whether you believe in climate change or you don't believe in climate change, rain happens, tornadoes happen, wildfires. Again, if you're in California, if you're a tech company in California, wildfires happen. And something you really have to think about, and this is one of your responsibilities as an IT professional, is you have to ask yourself, what happens if your server room literally melts down? Not, oh no, somebody unplugged a server, the server room's melting down. No, seriously, like there's like a 2,000 acre fire going on in California right now. Like literally, like what happens literally if your server room gets melted to slag? And so you may sit there and you go, well, I've got offsite backups, right? We're backing up to the cloud, so we'll be fine. But remember, a backup is not useful. Like users cannot log into a backup. I can't file share or get email from my backup, right? I need a live instance of the server to actually be able to do work. And so if you're an IT manager, if you're an IT professional, if you're using disaster recovery as a service, again, use a product like Veeam or many of the other products out there, you have a service provider, you've backed up all of your instances up onto their servers. Again, a flood comes through, a tornado comes through, a wildfire comes through, whatever else, you are able to spin up all of those instances within their cloud infrastructure, be able to point your users to that cloud infrastructure. And now, because again, think about it, like, if your building burns down, right? If your building burns down, you're going to need to be contacting your customers. You're going to need to be contacting your vendors. You're going to need to be contacting your salespeople, right? After a disaster, that is the most important time to be able to have communication and to be able to, again, to move files, have people to log in, all that kind of stuff. So if you're able to spin up essentially your infrastructure up on a service provider's cloud infrastructure, and literally by lunch, the day after a wildfire melts down your entire building, as far as you're concerned, the infrastructure is working, and you're just waiting for the CEO to write you a couple of checks so you can build out a new data center. That makes life better for everybody. And also, again, in the real technology world, you don't have a job if your business goes bankrupt, right? So if everything melts down and all you've got is backups, and that delays work for nobody can do any work for a week or two until you can put those backups onto a physical machine, that probably means you're not going to have a job very long, because if your business goes bankrupt, you're done. On the other hand, again, like I say, if you can spin up those instances using disaster recovery as a service, everybody is able to do the work. Then they're talking to their customers and they're figuring things out. They're talking to the vendors. They're figuring what they can do. And then, hey, maybe, you'll only have a wildfire to deal with. You won't have a wildfire and a joblessness to deal with. So these are some of the things to think about. And again, it's why cloud computing is so vital and so important at this point in time. And again, if your infrastructure, if you're dealing with 100 users and you've literally got like, I don't know, 2 Active Directory servers and that's about it, you really need to be thinking about how you can really leverage all of this cloud technology, because it's just amazing compared to what we were dealing with not that long ago. So as always, I enjoyed doing this video and look forward to seeing you on the next one.